Well, good afternoon, everyone. I thank you for braving the weather. I know some of you actually got pretty wet on your way here, so we really appreciate you making the effort. And we also hope you enjoyed the lunch and got to talk to the other people that were able to join us today. My name is Fernanda Bianchi, and I'm the Research and Development Director at the Global Women's Institute. And I would like, on behalf of our institute, to welcome all of you to this very important panel discussion as our third event in celebration of this year's 16 Days of Activism Against Gender Violence campaign. In our inaugural year, GWI brought the 16 Days of Activism to the campus of the George Washington University for the first time in 2012, making this year's events our second year of participating in this internationally recognized annual campaign that aims to raise awareness about gender-based violence and build strength around the movement to end it. And if I may, I would like to just say a few words about our institute. And first, of course, I'd like to acknowledge our wonderful GWI team. Mary Ellsberg, our director, who doesn't need much introduction. She's right there in red. And Diana Rango and Sharon here. I guess you're all busy still outside. And Chelsea and Stephanie, who welcomed you guys in our front desk. At the Global Women's Institute, we are advancing gender equality through research, education, and civic engagement, and by strengthening the global knowledge base of gender issues, preparing the next generation of leaders, and urging action, GWI aims to make a difference in the lives of women around the world, both local and global. As a university-wide initiative, the Institute hopes to be a catalyst for action that links faculty and students with international researchers, practitioners, activists, and policymakers, as we have in our panel today, to prevent and respond to all forms of violence against women and girls. As a kickoff of our immigration initiative, the Global Women's Institute will be focusing this year's 16 Days of Activism events around violence experienced by migrant women. Human trafficking endangers lives and is a type of violence that knows no borders. Hundreds of thousands of women and girls are coerced into labor and sex for the purpose of exploitation every year. And our panel of experts today will be leading a very lively and interesting discussion, I'm sure, on human trafficking of women searching for solutions. We hope you enjoy the wonderful panel we've assembled for you this afternoon, and that you also plan to attend our next events, one being a panel on violence against women as a cross-border issue, which will address the linkages between immigration reform and violence against women and girls. It will also be launching during that event a policy brief written in collaboration with our partner. We belong together on this topic as well. The panel will take place next Tuesday, December 10th, from 3 to 5 on our campus. And information is available both in the tables that you saw here and outside, and also on our website. And our last quick plug before we hear from the panel is that GWI, in collaboration with the Sexual Violence Research Initiative, is hosting a gender-based violence science fair where those who are doing research on GBV can submit a brief video explaining their work for the chance to win $4,000 towards their research. The deadline for submissions has been extended until June 1st, so if you're interested, you can see Diana at the end of our event or grab more information also outside. Now, without any further ado, I'm honored to introduce the moderator of our distinguished panel, Amy Mahoney, who is the head of the Counter-Trafficking and Protection Unit at the International Organization for Migration, or IOM. In her 9 years at IOM Washington, Mrs. Mahoney has been involved with a variety of counter-trafficking projects. Her current portfolio includes the management of global projects that focus on the provision of technical assistance, training for law enforcement and judiciary, capacity building for NGOs and governments, and direct assistance for victims of trafficking. She also serves as donor liaison and provides monitoring assessment for IOM globally for counter-trafficking and vulnerable migrants projects funded by the United States government. She was responsible for the development of IOM's counter-trafficking training modules and performance indicator handbook for counter-trafficking programs, as well as the exploratory assessment of trafficking in persons in the Caribbean region. Ms. Mahoney also serves as an adjunct professor on immigration-related issues at Trinity University. She has an MA in International Development and a BA in International Studies. Thank you so much for joining us today, Amy, and I'll turn it over to you, to our panel. Thank you.
Can I sit and talk? Is that okay?
Absolutely, and I'm going to give you the mic.
Thank
so
you.
don't have to
And I'm
go
nice
anywhere.
and short, so this is perfect. Great. So thank you very, very much, Fernanda, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the Global Women's Institute for inviting me here to moderate today, and to GW University, of course, for hosting. I'm very excited to be here with an extremely distinguished panel. Some of you I have known very much over the years, some of you I'm just getting to know. I've been told to keep this informal, but I also have to time keep, so we're going to see how I can balance that out. We'll see how it goes. So if I could just ask each of you to please take 2 minutes to introduce yourself, your name, what organization you come from, and just a little bit about your position and the mission of your organization. So we'll go in order, and first I'll turn it to Michele.
Thanks. I'm Michele Clark. I teach here at the LA School of International Affairs. I teach courses on women in global politics, a course on dissident and memoirs, and in particular, of particular relevance to this topic, I teach a course on human trafficking. I've been involved in the field of combating human trafficking since the late 1990s, when I was living in the Middle East and had a very powerful first-hand encounter with a young woman from Ukraine who had been trafficked into the sex trade in Israel. I met her at a picnic on the beach. No one was using the word trafficking. No one was using, no one was talking, there was no UN protocol, there was no tip law, there was no tip report. And yet when I met her, at the end of our conversation, I felt that something was profoundly wrong in the universe. That a young woman, the mother of two, could leave her children behind, her elderly parents behind, and be exploited brutally for sex for the benefit of others and reaping no gain for herself on the streets, in public, day after day after day. At that moment, something broke in my own heart, something broke in the world, and I thought that I had to find out why. We all are motivated by certain questions. Mine is why. Why do things happen? It's probably the more frustrating question, but it's also, for me, the more interesting question. My quest led me to become involved in the anti-trafficking community in Israel, which then, at the end of 2000, I came back to the United States and became involved in the anti-trafficking or CAIR, the organization which I helped to lead, the protection project at SICE, School of Advanced International Studies at Hopkins, was involved in some of the first national trainings of trafficking around the country, and we also conducted field research around the world to help the State Department and others identify exactly what this is. Who are victims of trafficking? How does it occur? What are government positions on this? So I traveled the world, interviewed victims of trafficking, and got to see a lot more on the ground than I ever thought I would in my life. That work led me to be the first director of the Anti-Trafficking Assistance Unit at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where my mandate involved helping 56 member states, spanning all the former Soviet Union, East and Western Europe, to the United States and Canada, to implement their commitments to eliminate trafficking. I now teach and consult and lecture and love raising up the next generation of activists. I'm also very committed to the idea of education as one concrete, specific tool that we can provide. As Shamere so articulately said at lunch, women come, they're rescued, they're brought out of situations, then what? They need to move forward. Basic literacy, in many cases in this country, is one of the keys to doing it.
Thank you. Sure.
My name is Sharon Lambert. I'm here at GW Department of Psychology. I'm an associate professor of clinical and community psychology. Most of my work focuses on adolescents and families and how they manage labor and race-related stress. I do a lot of work on neighborhood disorganization, community violence exposure, and what increases the risk for that type of violence exposure. I became involved in this issue as I was asked to be on the committee that authored the report that came out recently about commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking of minors in the United States. So I was the representative psychologist on the group. I worked with a team of lawyers, medical professionals, service providers, and a pretty multidisciplinary group with different sort of range of experience and exposure to this issue. to sort of summarize the state of the knowledge in the area, sort of in terms of the research that's available. What do we know? What do we need to know? And what are what's the involvement and the efficacy of the different sectors that are involved in this, ranging from law, medicine, education, social service, et cetera, right? So it's a consensus report, so meaning that we all sort of put our different ideas in to summarize what was out there, with the goal of making some recommendations that can lead to intervention and policy change, hopefully that we'll be seeing soon. So my role right now is helping to disseminate the results of the report, and working with different agencies and individuals who are interested in sort of moving forward based on the recommendations that we came up with in that report.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. Before we move on, can I just do a quick check? Can everyone hear decently in the room? You can all hear okay? Okay, great.
Could you take the microphones and pass them down? I'm just wondering if that might be easier or not. Okay.
Shamere, do you have a big voice?
I sure do.
There we go. Then let's hear it.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's such an honor and a pleasure for me to be here today. I'm Shamere McKenzie, and I'm with Trafficking International. And I must say that this work is not something I would ever dream of doing, being involved in human trafficking for a very long time. It's something I ran away from, being involved in the movement, because as some call it, some would say I was a victim of trafficking, some would say I'm a survivor of trafficking, but I consider myself a liberator, one who has broken free from the chains of her past and is moving into my future, breaking free from those chains, so I'm no longer bound. And I'm doing that not for myself, but so that I can help others, to ensure that others don't have to walk in the shoes that I walk in, and to educate people to protect their own children and to make a difference in the life of others. I learned about Shared Hope International 2 years prior to working there. I learned about the advocacy that they're doing in terms of changing laws, and I heard about that through Melissa Snow. When I heard what she was doing, I said to her, I want to do that. Because sadly for me, I was prosecuted as a result of my trafficking, and I now hold a federal conviction as a result of my trafficking. So when I learned that Shared Hope was getting involved in changing policy, I said, that's what I want to do. Happily, 2 years later, I became the program assistant at Shared Hope International. And Shared Hope was founded by former Congresswoman Linda Smith, who, while on a trip to India while she was in Congress, she was exposed to the brothels in India. When she came back, she felt like she had just something that she must do to eradicate trafficking. And at that time, like Michele said, it wasn't even called trafficking. So she started Shared Hope International, and Shared Hope has 3 tiers or 3 umbrellas, like I like to call it. The first one is prevention, where we do a lot of training, we have a lot of resources, in just training different professionals, speaking to students on how they can prevent getting a victim of trafficking. We also have our restoration umbrella, where we provide grants and technical assistance to international organizations that focus on trafficking and national organizations. We fund organizations in India, Nepal, Fiji, and Jamaica. And we have 7 national organizations here that we also fund. On the table outside, you may have seen a form that looks like this, or the front looks like this. This is our Protecting Innocence Challenge. This is under our Justice umbrella, where we analyze state laws and provide recommendations to states on how they can improve their laws, because we understand that when it comes to state laws, there are some gaps. State laws are not parallel to federal laws, and a lot of these cases are tried at a state level. And because we understand that, and we know that legislators, they have a lot of things to do. And trafficking may not even be one of the things that's on their radar. So what Shared Hope does, we go in and we do the work, we look at the laws in each state, so all the 50 states, including Washington, D.C., and then we provide recommendations to these states on how you can improve the laws to protect victims, right? To provide resources for law enforcement and policymakers, to have stronger penalties in place for those who are buying victims, and for facilitators as well. The outcome of this is that we give each state a letter grade on what they're doing on their laws. Happily, this year, couple of states finally got an A. When we first did this in 2011, almost half the states were failing. Gladly, in 2012, we see that 3 states got an A. So that tells me that there's work being done, because when I was in the line, I didn't think anyone cared. Someone cares about me. When Kevin Bales first told me I can share my story with others, I said, Kevin, no one's going to want to hear that. I don't even want to hear it, right? But just to see so many of you here, be sitting on a panel, especially sitting on a panel with Michele Clark. I've heard great things about Michele. I've had opportunities to meet with her in person. So it's just an honor, and like these other ladies, this is the first time I'm meeting them, but I've heard about Michele Clark. I've heard about the work that she's done. So for me to be sitting in this room on a panel with Michele, it's like, wow.
No pressure, Michele. No pressure, Michele. It's okay.
So thank you so much, and that's a little about me.
Thank you so much, Shamere. Okay. All right.
You all have a wonderful good voice for the recording of the event, and we're asked you guys to
Okay. Mari, please. Thank you.
I'm Dorn-Lopez. I am a staff attorney with CAIR Coalition. I work in the Detained Children's Program at CAIR Coalition. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you turn it on? Should I start again? There. Now you can hear me better. I'll start again just for the camera, I guess. I'm Mari Dorn-Lopez, and I work with CAIR Coalition. I'm a staff attorney there, and I'm in the Detained Children's Program. And CAIR Coalition, we also have an adult program. We work with adults in immigration detention centers in Virginia and Maryland. The children's program, our detention centers are located in Virginia. And we work with the most vulnerable populations, and we try and meet with them and educate them and hopefully help them with different forms of relief for immigration purposes. And it's really, really rewarding. I'm very lucky to get to do what I do. Specifically, I came to CAIR Coalition a little bit over a year ago, and one of the shelters that I was privileged enough to get to work with is actually a shelter in Virginia where we have a lot of girls who have, a lot of them are pregnant or already have babies. So it's very unique because in the population of immigrants coming across, the women and the girls, it's far fewer girls than it is boys. There's predominantly boys coming across. So the fact that we have so many girls that we do get to work with here, it actually is a real privilege getting to know them and getting to know their stories. And it's an honor to have them trust us to share that information, and then hopefully, in turn, we can help them with their immigration cases. So that's a little bit of what I do.
Great. Thank you. And Lara. Is this okay? All right. I'm Lara Powers. I work with the Polaris Project, in particular the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, which is the national hotline for the United States, primarily funded through the Department of Health and Human Services, but run by the Polaris Project. We get calls 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. We get calls from victims and survivors who may actually be in their situation and need extraction, and we will help coordinate that. We get calls, tips from community members that we will review and report depending on the situation. To law enforcement contacts, we get calls from survivors who are out of their situation looking for different resources to move forward, whether that's legal advocacy for vacating convictions or case management. We also get calls for training and technical assistance throughout the United States. And people who just want information, so if you're a student and you want information about human trafficking, feel free to call the hotline at any time. My role specifically is to manage the Mid-Atlantic region, which is DC, Maryland, Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Delaware. And so what that means is all of the cases coming in from those states are passed through to me, and I review them and coordinate that anti-trafficking response. So that can involve getting law enforcement involved, getting them to work with service providers, making sure the tips are going to the right places and being responded to, and just managing that anti-trafficking response in general. So that's basically the gist of what I do. I'll keep it short so that we can move on.
Great. Thank you very much to all of you. So as you can see, we have a very diverse and very experienced panel of guests here with us today.
So the format for the rest of the afternoon will be that I'll ask a standard set of questions, one to each of the panelists, and we'll give them some time to respond. Then I'll ask a general question that everyone can kind of put their 2 cents in on. And then I'll do a bit of a wrap-up, and then we'll open it to you all. So you definitely have a chance to get up to come to the mic and ask your questions. And then I think at the end, maybe some people will stick around and have some informal conversations as well if you're interested in that. So with that, Michele, the famous lady of the panel, apparently. To be fair, I knew about Michele Clark when I started in this in 1999 too, so I know where you're coming from. Yeah. Okay, so Michele, as we've all heard, you have a lot of experience with the OSCE, with Hopkins and the Protection Project. And to kind of back up and give us a bit of a framework, we all know that this is a very sizable issue, the issue of human trafficking, especially of women and girls in the world. If you could give us a bit of your understanding of the breadth of the problem and speak to the drivers behind trafficking of women and girls in particular.
I was telling Amy at lunch, in anticipation of this question, I happened to think of the movie Miss Congeniality, when she was, I don't know if you've heard it, seen it, it's a great, fun movie. I saw it on a plane not too long ago. And Sandra Bullock is posing as an undercover cop in a Miss America pageant, and they are asking the question, well, what do you think is the greatest problem of the world? And everyone is saying, world peace, world peace, world peace. And they come to her and she says, we need more concerted efforts at training law enforcement to eradicate the crime and go after the criminals, and world peace. So I felt a little bit about that when asked to address the question of the breadth of human trafficking, big, bad, evil, but then we'll go into specific. I just finished teaching one of the classes I have here at GW, and it's the class is entitled Women and Global Politics. There we spend a lot of time discussing the implications of boy preference. Boys are favored from birth, and in some cases even before birth. From the time they're children, they eat better, they study longer, they inherit more, their political voices are stronger. To take Kevin Bale's name again, and to paraphrase him, all people are disposable, but women just happen to be more disposable than others. This inherent inequity before the legal systems, this inherent preference and assumption that somehow women are not quite worth what men are, is one of the fundamental challenges that we're dealing with when we're talking about human trafficking. It's just okay. Somehow, in the ethos of our times, it becomes okay to market 14, 15, 11, 12-year-old girls on street corners in our nation's capital. It becomes okay to employ a young Sri Lankan, Nepali, Bangladeshi woman as a housekeeper, pay her little money, not let her out of the house, maybe require to have sex with the husband, eat scraps from the trash, sleep on a urine-stained mattress in the floor. That's okay. It becomes okay to put thousands of workers, female workers in South Asia in conditions, in factories where you can see cracks in the pillars and where the managers say, you complain one more time and I fire you. It's fundamentally not okay. But until we convince, first of all, ourselves, and second, the cultures in which we live and move and consume, because we have to readily acknowledge the power and the force of consumption in this, then women will continue to be exploited. And the primary driver is the dynamics of exploitation. There are two dynamics that enter into what allows this to happen. There are individuals who are vulnerable. And women are trafficked more than men. We know this. The numbers around the world indicate, for all the reasons that are logical. They're trafficked more than men because they are more vulnerable than men,
because they're considered of less value, because the voices that would protect a woman are not as loud as the voices that would protect a boy. They're trafficked because of their inherent strengths and virtues and things that we love about women, which is wanting at any cost to provide for your family and care and protect and feed. And that's one of the most perfidious aspects of exploitation, in that elements which are fundamentally good and worthy are twisted and preyed upon. Young women who are trafficked into domestic service want to provide for their families. That's the fundamental reason that they enter into these situations. They think they can get something, not just for themselves, but for their families. I live across the street from a young woman who was trafficked. Well, the tragedy is compounded. She was originally a survivor of the Rwandan genocide, did the march from Kigali to Kampala, grew up in a refugee camp in Uganda, was provided with a job opportunity to work in the United States, ended up her life as a domestic servant, ended up being extricated because she happened to pick up a pamphlet at an airport which said, if you're in trouble, call this number. So you've got this dynamic of exploitation, and exploitation because of vulnerability. What's the other side of the driver? The other side of the driver is the demand, the pull, this deep, entrenched need, desire to say, I want something. And if I can buy it, if I can pay for it, then it's okay. And the idea of paying for it renders that thing for that person into a commodity and justifies any treatment that you happen to do, whether it's for sex, or whether it's for cheap labor, or whether it's service. The idea of the commodification justifies an extensive range of abuses on that. We see this in particular in the commercial sex trade, where the idea of buying sex has opened up young girls and women into abusive treatments. Many people, and I was living and working in Europe in the early days of the prostitution movement, and I'll just the discussion of should prostitution be legal in order to eliminate trafficking, should it not? If we legalize it, will we make it easier? And there were two great experiments that now 10 years later we begin to see. Der Spiegel in the spring published an article that basically debunked the myth that legalizing prostitution in Germany would help trafficking, and they're saying, in fact, it hasn't. Well, the instances of the Netherlands has also shown that 10 years after lifting the ban on brothels, organized crime increased, the trafficking of children and minors increased. The red light windows in the Netherlands were occupied not by Dutch women who were taking advantage of a legalized and protected system, but were occupied by women who couldn't speak a word of Dutch, who were there with fraudulent papers and who had been trafficked. So I'll stop now, but the core of trafficking is exploitation, driven by things that are common to all of us, brutally exploited because of an imbalance of power, which sees women as lesser and weaker for the service of people who think that because they pay, and pay at a discount, that it's okay to treat individuals as they want. I find it particularly ironic that in the case of many instances of domestic servitude, which is the second greatest form of trafficking into the United States, these very same people who balk at paying a living wage to their domestic servant are arguing for incremental salary increases of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So there's particular irony there that does not go unnoticed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michele. So, the framework all the way from the beginning, where boys are definitely preferred, to vulnerability and demand and thinking that it's okay. I think often people look at this as something that doesn't necessarily happen in this country, things that happen overseas or to people from other countries. But Sharon, I think maybe your experience will speak to this a little bit differently. You recently participated in the Institute of Medicine's report on commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking of minors in the United States. So we've heard a bit from Michele about how human trafficking is framed in terms of gender disparities and vulnerabilities. But tell us a little bit about what you found about what's going on here in our own backyard and some of the major findings of the report.
Okay, so this report is commissioned by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and our charge is really to focus on minors in the United States. So that is any minor, no matter how they got here, we were concerned with all the young people that are here. So we focused on, we collected our information from a diversity of backgrounds, and we met with survivors, practitioners, law enforcement. We did a lot of site visits throughout the country, sort of get an idea of what the state of the art was, what the status quo was, what the expectations were, and we reviewed a lot of the literature that was available, which on average the quality is quite poor. In the report, we're only allowed to summarize really rigorous research. And that's why in the report we say a lot, there's not a lot of good information out there. And for those of you who know research, you need to be able to find and label things appropriately to get the information. And it's almost impossible to do because people are not signing up for studies about, I bought sex from a 5-year-old or 6-year-old, right? They're not signing up for this stuff. So in some ways, that was a big challenge for us. What was startling for all of us was to figure out how common this is. And a lot of that came from anecdotal information. There's not really good numbers out there for some of the reasons I mentioned in terms of knowing how much is going on with young people, right? This is something that's hidden. I'm talking to people that actually know these things already. I'm used to talking to people who are like, what? That happens here? And it's really hard to uncover and find. What we were most shocked about is something Shamere just alluded to, is that a lot of victims and survivors who are young people, their first encounter with an intervention is something as being treated as a criminal. And so we really were concerned about sort of identifying that in the report, is that victims and survivors have lots of consequences, and sometimes the interventions that are designed or supposedly to help them really can just be re-traumatizing. So there's a lot of law enforcement that say we're just trying to help, but then when you're arresting or detaining or criminalizing young people, that's not necessarily so helpful, right? So that's one of the concerns that we had. So in addition to that, there's obviously legal and social, medical, safety, lots of different consequences that are immediate as well as long-term. And those consequences for the victims and survivors far outweigh the ones for the people that are actually committing the crimes. We found that there's a lot of inconsistency, but very few consequences for the people that are exploiters and traffickers. A lot of inconsistencies, Shamere noted, across states. Lots of variability in terms of who might be sort of identified or have any sort of or be held accountable at all, which is also concerning. We also focus a little bit on thinking about facilitators, so people who either turn the other way or people who knowingly are participating either as businesses or involved in transportation and sort of facilitating this process, who are sort of helping sort of perpetuate the problem. In addition, for the people that obviously that are purchasing these services are sort of continuing the problem, so we also identified some of the concerns there. And the larger thing that we really sort of came down on is that a lot of this is a societal problem, as you know. So the fact that many of us didn't know what was going on, I say us, people outside this room, but people in the communities don't really recognize that this goes on here, that a lot of us that come in contact with children as educators, as neighbors, as friends, as family members, as service providers who come into contact with children regularly or young people don't know what to look for, don't know what to ask. I'm trained as a clinician. I worked in the emergency room a lot. I was trained on how to interview people about domestic violence and child maltreatment more broadly, but I'm wondering how many people did I miss and which questions did I not ask? And if I did ask and identify something, I wouldn't have known who to refer to or what to do about it. There's lots of pieces missing in terms of how to do intervention, how to design prevention. So in terms of the sort of recommendations we came up with in terms of prevention, a lot were focused on increasing awareness, really trying to figure out how can we let the rest of the community know that this is not something that just happens in other countries, that this is not something that happens to somebody else's neighbors, that this is about somebody else's sister or whatever. It can happen to the person sitting right next to you, or may have already. And so we said a lot of things about how to increase awareness and how to work with training. There are trainings going on throughout the country, but they're sort of sporadic and inconsistent. Some organizations or services get trained, but they're really isolated in one time, and only part of the staff gets trained and has the expertise, and it's not really a consistent, ongoing process. And those trainings are often underfunded. We're thinking about ways that we can intervene with schools and healthcare professionals who regularly interact with young people. A lot of work is going on. Shared Hope is doing great work in terms of identifying how peers can sort of communicate this information. So there are some isolated efforts that are going on. Another thing in terms of prevention is trying to figure out what are the best ways to try to hold accountable the people that are actually committing the crimes. And so there's lots of information about the disparities across states in terms of what gets prosecuted and what does not, how certain people are allowed to get away with things in certain states and not others. And so we try to point out some of those inconsistencies and make recommendations about best practices that are happening in certain states, I guess the ones that are getting the A's, and how we can sort of translate that across different states. So we point out some model programs and try to identify how other states might be able to model those behaviors. We're also interested in things that are related to what Michele was alluding to in terms of expectations about power and behavior, what's okay for girls versus boys, what counts as violence, what doesn't, in terms of knowing for young people, for adults, for people that might be considering purchasing, what does it mean and what's okay? For young people themselves, what should they be looking out for? In terms of thinking about how kids might get recruited into this sort of activity, thinking about what's okay and what's not. And when we think about intervention, I'm a school-based kind of prevention person. We think about if schools are a great place to do an intervention, but some schools you can't mention the word sex. So it raises all sorts of issues. So we're trying to raise awareness and understanding about what kinds of information we can use and how we can get the information out. And how can we borrow from some effective programs, like we have programs in schools about child maltreatment, about bullying, about dating violence that are fairly effective, and can we borrow from some of those programs to make them more acceptable to talk about some of these issues? I think that's it. Those are the basic summary findings. I'm happy to answer other questions, but really we're trying to point out a lot of where the holes are, and while people are paying attention to this issue, try to raise suggestions about policies and practices and procedures that might sort of hopefully lessen the problem and help us turn it around.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharon. Some really important points. How do you find the issue and label it if your population that you want to speak to doesn't want to speak to you? How do you work around treating potential victims or survivors as criminals and actually trying to provide assistance? And consequences for exploiters. I think across the board for the crime of human trafficking and sexual exploitation crimes, this is a really big problem that we face. And I think there's a lot more that we need to do to look at this. And perhaps in the realm of policy change, which brings me to Shamere. As we were noting, the Institute of Medicine's report highlighted also needs to make policy change and prevention a high priority in combating the crime of human trafficking. So as a survivor, you've already told us that you feel like a liberator, and I think that that's a fantastic term. If you could tell us how you turned your experience and your passion into a mission to work on the issue of ending sex trafficking and how your experience forms your daily work.
Like I said before, doing this work was not something I wanted to do. I believe I just was supposed to keep quiet because of the shame and the guilt that comes from having experienced being trafficked. But the only reason, well, one of the reasons, not the only reason, one of the reasons I'm able to even sit here today is through the support of others. A lot of time people hear about trafficking and people are so caught up on this rescue aspect. I have to go out there and I have to go get this girl from this pimp. I have to go get this girl out of the situation. And I find that the more we spread awareness on this issue, that's where a lot of brains go. What can I do? I want to go get the girl. And some of us don't even understand that that's not our niche, because we can create even a bigger problem by trying to go get this girl. But for me, I had the support of individuals. When I came to Shared Hope, I already started sharing my story because I met Kevin Bales, who really showed me what it meant to share my story, who showed me what I need to have in place in terms of when a college contacts you, this is what you need to discuss, you need to have an honorarium. And even then I was like, an honorarium? Someone's gonna pay me for telling them what happened to me? That doesn't even make sense. In my world, I didn't even think that made sense. But here I had individuals that showed me the way, all right? When I came to Shared Hope, that was a big, I just don't know how to describe my experience at Shared Hope, because Shared Hope has molded me into the individual you see today. Shared Hope taught me to look beyond what happened to me and to look into my future, that I am not my story. So when I started at Shared Hope, and if you come to Shared Hope, they will never come to you and say, here's our survivor, Shamere McKenzie. It will never happen if you come to visit Shared Hope. Shared Hope see me as an individual. They see me as a human being. And that's a way that I'm able to use what happened to me to inform my work. Just being seen as a human being. You know, a lot of times you see survivors, you're like, oh, there goes the survivor, as if the survivor is a celebrity or something, right? Like, oh, I got to take a picture with you. Why? I'm just a regular person, just like you. We all face adversity, right? Some of our adversities we will dare not speak about, right? But I choose to share mine. And at Shared Hope, I'm able to use the aspect of me being criminalized to inform policy. Right? So now that I'm a criminal, there are some barriers that affects my restoration. And I'm able to share with Shared Hope, look, in applying for financial aid, I can't do that. I can't apply for certain scholarships because I'm a convicted felon. I can't get certain jobs because I'm a convicted felon. Right? And to make matters even worse, I'm seen as a sex offender. Something that I had to really think about and accept, because in my mind, how am I a sex offender? I've never molested a child in the terms of how society views a sex offender, not understanding that it's a very broad, label, right? So in my mind, I couldn't even come to understanding that or accepting the fact that I'm a sex offender. And Shared Hope helped me to break down those barriers to see, okay, this happened to you, but this is how you can inform us so it doesn't happen to someone else. So they listened to me, and even the bottom girl phenomenon, and I'm going back to school next semester, and that's going to be my research that I want to contribute to the movement, to really understand what it means to be the bottom girl. Because it's being talked about, but no one have really dug into it to understand that she's mostly abused than the other girls, right? And so even that, Shared Hope asked me on one occasion to put a presentation on the bottom girl for them. And I'm like, they're asking me? You guys have been in existence for 15 years. Like, what can I tell you that you don't already know? And I was very nervous, saying, oh, this is Linda Smith, and this is Samantha Vardaman. They've been doing this work for years. What can I tell them that's different? But the fact that they sat in a room and they listened to what I had to say about my own experience, and then took that information to a larger scale, that speaks volume to me. And that is how everyone can really provide support to survivors, right? They gave me financial support because, we have housing is great, but do you expect a survivor to stay in the house forever? What about financial independence, right? So my writing skills are not the best, and we all have areas we need to work on. For me, it's my writing skill. And at Shared Hope, when I'm told to write my speech, I have to sit down, and that's the hardest part to me. I'll just get up and talk, right? But to write it down, no. And at Shared Hope, they provide that support for me when I write my speech. At first, I used to sit down with 5 members of staff and say the speech to them. And for me, I was like, this is not the way I'm going to say it. Why do I need to sit with you guys? And then they will all have their notepad, and they will write little comments and give me feedback. And I remember Eliza, I used to have my speech, and she had me say it 6 times. And I'm like, why do I have to say this thing 6 times? This is my life. I don't need to rehearse it. But I find that it was a part of developing a professional development, of adding to the skills that I need that transforms not only for Shared Hope, but beyond the organization.
Wow, I don't really know how to follow that, Shamere. Thank you very much. Extremely excellent insights. Just kind of keeping things at the individual level. I think this is often forgotten when we start trying to plan our policies and our programs, and trying to remember that people are human beings and we all have our experiences to contribute. I think that's a really, really important point. From there, Mari, you got a tough act to follow here, sorry. Okay, so you work with the Capital Area Immigrants' Rights Coalition, which seeks to ensure immigrants are treated with fairness and dignity and respect for their human and civil rights. Sometimes we don't recognize that forced migration is actually can be a form of trafficking. Can you tell us about cases related to trafficking that you've been involved in and what the legal recourse is available for those who have been trafficked in the United States as foreign nationals, and what is needed to help prevent further exploitation of those persons?
Yeah,
Thanks.
absolutely. I'll try and keep it short. I think there's a lot of questions in there. Thank you again for having me. But I just wanted to share a couple stories. Like I said, I'm very fortunate to get to meet with these. I meet mostly with the kids. However, like I said, we have the adult program. So I am somewhat aware of some of the cases that have gone on there. And they generally kind of fall within these similar fact patterns. I recently had a girl who was from Guatemala who was 16 years old. And her case, she came to the U.S., was journeying here because her family was very poor. They lived in very difficult circumstances back home. They really had no other option than to send their daughter to the United States in hopes that she would have a better future and then in turn that her family would. In order to come here, she contacted through a friend a young man. She believed he was around 18 years old. They would communicate over the phone. He helped set up the trip for her to come across. When she arrived, she was supposed to then get help and assistance getting a job and going to school and things like that and housing. She journeyed all the way from Guatemala on her own, traveling up through Mexico. It's a very, very dangerous journey, especially for young girls who are all on their own. She crossed through the river and then was actually in the desert in Texas. She was walking in the desert for days with no food or water or very little. And while this was happening, this supposed young man contacted her parents back home and proposed to her mother that she be his girlfriend, in which case he would forgive the debt. She had to pay a large sum of money to come to the U.S. for him to set everything up. And if she would be his girlfriend, then her mother and father would he would forgive the debt, which for them was a really big deal. So she arrived locally, and when she arrived, red flags started going up. She met this man. He was much, much older than she thought he was. He was in his 30s. She was taken in the middle of a night to an apartment with a woman who was staying there watching her. And this man would come and visit her multiple times. She felt very, very uncomfortable. And then she was told she would be taken to another house with other women. And she got wind of the fact that she was going to be put into prostitution. This young girl was brave enough to convince the woman actually that she was staying in the apartment with that something was wrong. And they were actually together able to alert authorities, who were then able to kind of come in and take her out of the situation. They then put her in a detention center for juveniles in Virginia, which is where I met her. And the local authorities continued working with her. She talked with them, gave their stories so that they can hopefully catch the people the perpetrators, and then hopefully end this particular ring. But in this instance, she didn't know initially that she was being trafficked when she came over. It kind of turned into it once she was here, and she became aware of it when she was here. Another instance of what we see, and recently we met with a young girl who was actually 17 from Mexico. So she didn't have as far of a journey, but in Mexico, and sometimes we see this even with girls from other countries, in Mexico, the young girls, they're very young, they come from poverty. A lot of times it's very difficult circumstances for their families. And in this case, she had an older boyfriend, and the older boyfriend promised her things. In this particular instance, her mother needed some assistance. So he offered to pay her to help assist her with her mother and things like that. She ended up moving in with him. And they build a trusting relationship with these young girls. And then he started asking her to do things. She needed to perform sex acts so that he could pay off whatever debts he had and different things like that. And she was living with him at this point. He would drop her off at local bars and she would have sex with people at those bars. And then eventually he said that he was bringing her to the U.S. She did not want to come to the U.S. He had a sister in the U.S. Who we believe may also be involved with the prostitution. And she was being brought here and then was going to be placed in prostitution here in the United States. And again, she got caught at the border. We met her at a detention center here in Virginia. And we are just so fortunate to meet with these young girls and that they trust us and will open up to us and share their stories with us. And she did that, and she told us her story. Also, at these facilities, they're actually in the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. It's within the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Health and Human Services, pardon me, not ICE as the adults are, when they are minors. So she was in the custody of what we call ORR, and there they also have therapists, they have teachers, they have people who are working with the children there. And so she actually had access to therapists as well. So not only was she sharing the story with us, but also with her therapist. And then we could be there also when she was interviewed then by ICE and helping them, as they're very interested in her story so that they can help other people. Just really quickly, what we do once we do meet with the children, we give them general Know Your Rights presentations like on their forms of relief, and then we do their individual intakes to try and assess if there's anything that we can do. A very common form of relief, or a form of relief that's specific to trafficking victims, is called the T visa. So sometimes we will assist them in filing for a T visa or finding pro bono attorneys to help them file for this form of relief. And there's also other humanitarian forms of relief that they may be eligible for.
Great. Thank you very much, Mari. Again, very important point about trust building when you're working with individuals. And sounds like there's some great services that can be offered to those found in these situations in the United States, at least for the children that you've been working with. To use the cliche, last but not least, Lara. So we have talked a lot about sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation, but what we're going to ask you to do is talk a bit about labor trafficking, the global phenomenon of labor trafficking, and if you can talk a little bit about what's going on in the Mid-Atlantic region and specifically on issues of domestic workers. I know, as was said earlier by Michele, this is looking like the second biggest population, and I know we're seeing a lot of it in the United States, so if you could give us some of your experience.
Sure, and Michele, I'm really glad you mentioned it already. So the ILO actually estimates that there are significantly more labor trafficking victims worldwide than there are sex trafficking victims. And I say that not to compare or say that one is worse than the other, but they do need equal attention and equal resources. In terms of the NHTRC, about 1/3 of the calls that we get to the hotline are labor trafficking, not calls, but cases we get to the trafficking hotline are labor cases. And that really shows community awareness of the issue and not necessarily prevalence. And the most common type of labor trafficking case we get are domestic servitude cases. To give you some idea of victim demographics, 84% of those cases involve foreign nationals, and 87% of those cases involve women. So this clearly is an issue that affects migrant women very strongly in the United States. In terms of the Mid-Atlantic region, it is a hot spot for this kind of trafficking, especially in the DC, Virginia, Maryland area. We have a very large international presence. We have members working for the World Bank and other international organizations, foreign diplomats who bring domestic workers with them on certain visas like A3 visas, G5 visas, which tie the legal status of the employee to the employer. So what that means is if that employee wants to leave their working situation, they are no longer legally allowed to stay in the United States. And that's where the T visa comes in, but there's a process involved with that. So that is one method of control that we see. I'll broadly define domestic work as any work that's being performed within a household or for households. And we have live-in domestic workers and workers that live outside of their employer's home. Those workers that are living with the employer are even more vulnerable to exploitation because of the isolation that they often experience. So to kind of give you an idea of what these scenarios look like, I'm just going to tell a story from the hotline. I'm changing some of the names and details for confidentiality's sake, but this will paint a picture of what these cases kind of look like. So we received a call from a woman who was calling from a payphone. She didn't speak English, but she was able to communicate to us that she was in some kind of emergency, and we connected with an interpreter. She spoke French and learned that she was from Senegal and had been brought over by a French family 4 years earlier. And she had just escaped her situation and had been kept in the house for 4 years. She was not allowed to leave. She worked 24 hours a day, every day of the week, was not given breaks, was fed very little. She had no private access to communication, so all of her phone calls were monitored, email access were monitored. So you can imagine and she did not know where she was when she called us. She didn't know what state she was in. We had to ask a series of questions just to figure out her location. And so you can imagine how scary it must be to, one, know nothing about the country you're in, have no idea what kind of resources are available to you, and that lack of information is often exploited. So people that are exploiting their domestic workers will tell them, if you go out, you're going to get arrested. You can't trust law enforcement here. And all of this misinformation is used to keep these people controlled. So that paints a picture of the vulnerability that is especially specific to migrant women who might not have access to the resources or knowledge of the resources that are available to them, do not speak the language, are unfamiliar with the terrain. And we also see some amazing stories, though, of how they reach out. So we've had cases where the domestic worker will leave their house once a day to take the garbage out. And during that time, she will engage with the neighbor for 20 seconds during that day. And that is the turning point where she's able to get the information, get the hotline number, and find out a way to make that call, whether it's through her neighbor or somehow through a phone that she has when her employer is not aware of what's going on. Other things that make these workers vulnerable don't just apply to migrant women, but apply across the board to domestic workers. They're not protected by the Fair Labor Standards Act, which guarantees minimum wage and overtime pay. So a lot of these workers are paid little to nothing. The story that I gave you, she was paid $200 a month in the beginning, working 24 hours a day, but she hadn't been paid for over 6 months. So she was working for free. A lot of them don't have access to food, they're not sleeping, so there are a lot of physical implications with that. Other aspects of vulnerability include just general fear of the outside world, not knowing where to go. So it often starts with community members when reaching out to this population, or networking amongst themselves. So when one domestic worker will take the children to the park, she'll start talking with other domestic workers and learning that her experience isn't normal and isn't right. And so it's that kind of interaction that really can prompt someone to call the hotline and get the help that they need. So.
Thanks very much. No, the issue of domestic workers is a particularly difficult one, I would say, within the realm of working on this issue. When you have instances of what's going on inside of a person's household and how do you get access without breaching privacy issues. It also touches a bit upon the stereotypical thought of trafficking of people, which does happen, people being really locked and unable to move around, to see that actually some people do have access and they can get out, but there's a lot of other factors around why people don't leave. There's a lot of psychological and other control mechanisms that sometimes aren't well understood. So with that, we've done our first round of specific questions, and now there's something for all of you, so you just have to jump in, and then we'll figure out how to moderate it in time and do all of that, try to be free-flowing here. So the final question is to shed a little bit more positive light on all of this, and to ask you about what you're excited about, what you're seeing in terms of trafficking interventions, what is working, what are the lessons that we can all take from this and try to apply to other circumstances. Shamere, you look like you want to say something so bad.
Okay.
I just need to say first, however, that wow, I'm on the same panel as Shamere McKenzie.
There we go.
Well, what I see is that, one, awareness. A lot of people are now because they know now that human trafficking exists, because, if you should be honest with our own selves, and we ask our own selves, when you first heard about human trafficking, what did you think? Where did you think this happened? And if we're honest enough, we will say overseas. And we'll call the name of a country, of some other country, except the United States. So what I now see that there is a lot of awareness in the United States to show that this happens here in our own backyards. I also see that policy is starting to change. How I know this? I work for Shared Hope International, praise the Lord, right? In 2012, 2013, in 2012, when we did the Protected Innocence Challenge, what we do is we track legislation in all the 50 states. We use a tool called CapWiz, and we track what legislation is introduced, what legislation is passed. For the 2012 legislative session, we saw 240 bills introduced that was related to the Protected Innocence Challenge. And I was so excited. I jumped up and I was like, yes, things are being changed. But in 2013, I should have saved some of my excitement from 2012 because in 2013, the number doubled. So for the 2013 legislative session, 793 bills were introduced relating to the Protected Innocence Challenge. That tells me that a lot of work is being done because legislators, of course, they're the one that have to come together and say, hey, we need to pass this. But before it even gets to the legislative, to get a legislative action, people on the ground, right, like service providers, law enforcement, community members, they have to respond to drive the legislator to respond, right? So it's not just our legislator up here that say, hey, we need to implement this. Everyone is playing a part. So we see trainings. I am just excited when I get to train law enforcement. At Shared Hope, we do a lot of trainings for various professionals. And for me, I used to hate law enforcement because my pimp used to tell me the police is not your friend. The police will arrest you. And for me, when I was in the life, the police even mocked me. When I was on the track, they would tell me to take off my shoes and run, and they would say, if we catch you, we're going to lock you up. So I remember being in Brooklyn, taking off my shoes, and I'm running, and the police marked police NYPD. Every time they caught up to me, they would laugh and say, run faster. So the police was not my friend. For me now to be sitting in a room training law enforcement on how to identify and interact with victims of trafficking empowers me because, wow, you guys really care? When I speak to law enforcement officers, so I see that. I see where people, just regular, ordinary people, are asking, what can I do? What can I do to make a change? And I always tell people, change starts with self. Don't go blaming law enforcement for not doing their job. Don't blame educators for not teaching students. Don't blame parents. Don't blame Barack Obama. Blame yourself. Look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, what am I doing about this issue that I'm so angry about right now? Because change starts with self. And I think I got to leave some for somebody else.
Thank you very much. Passing it on. Any other exciting things?
Building off of that, just really briefly, the people that we do see in the adult detention centers generally do come in with criminal convictions. And that is something, and just building off of the need for education and awareness, we're seeing less of that now. Authorities are understanding more that they are victims and that these things are happening because of the victimization. So they don't necessarily have as many crimes, but they are still coming in with crimes and related to that victimization. So that can be a real issue for people. So just building off of that. And also, for the other side, a lot of them get into it very, very young, a lot of young girls. And being able to educate these young girls about what it is and kind of erasing the stigma in teaching them about it, then it helps them to open up to then hopefully help other ones. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of just education and getting the word out there.
Yeah, similarly, just to give, it's basically the same thing you guys are saying, but when Polaris first started, their approach was, let's go in and let's try to eradicate these networks. And what they realized was that on the ground, the baseline was not there to respond to these trafficking cases. Law enforcement wasn't ready. Service providers were not there to handle these cases. And what we're seeing now extensively throughout the United States is that baseline environment to respond to trafficking cases is there, which brings us to the next step of being able to actually attack these different networks and start with that eradication process, which is very exciting because it's going towards the end goal of getting rid of slavery altogether. Very ambitious, but it is our hope. So.
Put ourselves out of a job.
Yeah, exactly.
Please. Michele, Sharon, did you say anything else?
I think one thing that is encouraging, having gone around the country and sort of talked to people who are sort of working at the ground level, is that there's a surprisingly large number of people who are advocating on this issue, and despite sort of the really limited resources, the denial or just ignorance or just looking the other way in their own institutions and communities, who have been really successful in sort of integrating across systems in terms of healthcare, education, law enforcement, and communities and bringing people together to figure out creative ways to intervene and do prevention that are now becoming model programs. So they're not getting necessarily financial support. They're sort of going outside of their own organizations and sort of thinking outside the box to figure out how we're going to do something about this. And either that's, they're having to do this on their own time, but there are people that are willing to sort of make those changes. And now what we're able to do is document some of those efforts and sort of use those as examples for how other people can sort of move on. And I think that's really encouraging because there still is not a lot of great support there. There's still a lot of people who feel really restricted in sort of their own organizations or settings in terms of their ability to sort of do something. And once they see that somebody else is trying it and getting a little creative about it, and they realize that there is some change that's possible, then it really sort of inspires other people to move forward. So that's kind of encouraging for me.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely, Shamere. I would not stop you from saying something else, please.
I have a lot that I'm excited about, but I wanted other people to say that too. So I just kept mine very brief. But since no one brought up these 2 points, the first point that I forgot to say was demand. That now the country is starting to address demand, that are seeing that these men who purchase sex from these minors and these women, that they are being held liable. Now, we know that in certain states, the punishment for these buyers are very low. 30 days, 6 months. But we see that legislators are paying attention. And so certain states are trying to implement demand laws. I know Cindy's in the room, and she's trying to work on, that's Cindy, everyone, implementing a demand law in D.C., because we have to look at all pieces of this puzzle, not just going and taking down these pimps, because if there are no buyers, these pimps are going out of business, right? So we see that people are really starting to look at demand, and what I'm most excited about is that survivors are getting their voice back. Survivors are now moving past the shame and the guilt and can stand up and say, that's not, what I've been through is not who I am. I am more than my adversity.
That's what I'm excited about.
That's fantastic. That's a great thing to be excited about. Thank you. Excellent. So before I turn the floor over to all of you to ask your questions, I've been asked just to kind of wrap things up by saying maybe a couple of things about IOM and what we're doing in this field. And I should say I come from the IOM Washington office, but my portfolio is actually global coverage. So most of my focus and most of the projects that I work on are actually in other countries. However, we do, speaking of the T visa earlier, we do have a program for victims of trafficking found in the United States that choose to stay in the United States on a T visa process where we can help bring the derivative family members over to the United States from the countries of origin. So we work directly with our offices, with embassies, with NGOs in the United States on this program to bring derivative family members over. And so it's been, it's the only project of its kind, I believe. It was a gap that was identified in the TVPA. This regulation was put there, but then there was no money and no mechanism put towards it. So that is something that we do. And just to speak to the USA context for just a second, because I do see what's going on in the rest of the world, I always find it difficult for me, because I am American, to say this, but the States really does have the most advanced system going in terms of combating this crime. We absolutely do. The awareness raising that's there, the task forces that we have, the money that we put to it. One of the biggest complaints I see from law enforcement globally is that they can't get victim witnesses. They're trying to do their job of putting people behind bars, and they can't get victim witnesses. And the reason that there's 0.05% of victims will become victim witnesses globally, because there's no incentive to do it. And at least in the United States, I mean, there might be the personal incentive, but then what after that? You're going to put me through this again. I have to get on the stand. I have to tell my story again. You can't protect me. You can't protect my family. The case may not go in my favor. These traffickers might get out. Then what? And so there's very low incentive. And in the United States, at least, we do have the incentive of asset confiscation. We have retribution. So there are things in this country that I think a lot of other places are looking to as a model. So just kind of the go USA kind of bit on that. Just quickly, you know, for IOM, obviously we're looking at sex trafficking, we're looking at labor trafficking, we're looking at the links we find for women and girls. You're often being trafficked for sex and labor, and so it often goes hand in hand. In terms of prevention, of course, we're looking at curriculum in schools, we're talking to parents, we're talking to teachers. We do a lot with healthcare providers. We have a Caring for Trafficked Persons training that we try to give to healthcare providers, because as we know, sometimes healthcare providers see someone for just a few moments in time, and if they can ask maybe just a couple of the right questions, they might be able to assist in a way that they didn't realize they could assist. And then something else we're finding important in terms of the migration process is not just doing the cultural orientation before someone migrates, or the migrant resource information that for someone that might be looking for a job, but actually pre-decision counseling. And we're starting to do this in the Mekong region to look at, before you even decide to migrate, why have you decided to migrate, and what might be some of the alternatives, because as we all know, if people are looking for a better life, they're going to keep looking for it, regardless of what you say for the most part. And then just to go back to the individualized response, I think it's always important to remember that these are individuals, these are human beings, and the individualized response is absolutely necessary, and you can't kind of fix everyone with, it should be a holistic approach, but you really do have to target things specifically, whether it's your immediate care to your return and reintegration processes, and making sure reintegration processes are not just sending people back to their communities or their homes with a thank you very much for your participation in our program, or here's some cash, but really looking at what the medium and long-term needs of that person might be. And then, of course, when we talk to donors who fund these kinds of things, how you can actually follow up on these things over 6 months, a year and a half, to see if the programs we're implementing are actually effective, not only for the individual, but on the broader level. So that's my 2 cents about IOM. I want to thank everybody for being here. This has been very fantastic. It's always great to hear from the different perspectives of your collective work. And with that, I think I can turn it over to the audience. So if you have questions, maybe just come up to the microphone, or we can pass the microphone around if you're shy.
Hi, everybody.
I don't think so.
There we go. Awesome. Great panel. It was wonderful to hear from all of you. My name's Tiffany Williams, and I run the trafficking work for the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and before that I was a case manager. So everything you said about the difficulty in working in these cases, I absolutely agree with. One of the things that we're doing is increasing the outreach amongst workers. But the thing that we come up against is this divide between sex and labor. Not in just the media, but also in legislation. The laws that some of these really activist Congress people are passing actually leave out the survivors that we work with, including the child domestic workers. So my question is, what can our organizations do to overcome that divide? Because I think that we've been able to frame it today as a women's issue, which is really unifying. And I'm wondering, what are the other ways that we can unify, like individually with our organizations, to try to overcome this divide? Thanks.
I think Michele has an answer for you.
Well, I have something to consider. And I thank you so much for asking the question. It's very interesting. In the United States, our laws define trafficking into, we have 2 types of trafficking. We have sex trafficking and we have labor trafficking. In most of the countries around the world, based on the UN protocol to combat, to eliminate, suppress trafficking in human beings, especially women and children, known as the Palermo Protocol, trafficking, there's one form of trafficking. Trafficking is exploitation. All right, it's trafficking that happens as a result of illegal means for illicit purposes. And the primary purpose is exploitation. And so there's a much broader and more robust debate on acknowledging a wide variety of trafficking. But here we have 2 types of trafficking, and for many reasons, sex trafficking, it's an easier sell, frankly, has become predominant. But that aside, we need to ask why. Favorite question. Let's go to some of the few statistics that we actually know about that can help provide a framework for our discussion. Let's look at cases that are prosecuted in this country. human trafficking cases that are prosecuted are sex trafficking cases. Predominantly trafficked minors and predominantly young white girls. All right, there's this large study done by the Urban Institute that was released last year that looks at an analysis of trafficking prosecutions in different states, but pretty much the federal data will acknowledge that. And we use these statistics because they're about the only hard numbers that we have. Why? All right, in our judicial system, we have a trial by jury. DA is going to pitch a case that he can win. He's going to try a case which has a sympathetic victim. The victim is going to be sympathetic because the jury is going to get that person. And the jury is going to get that person because of what the members of the jury understand the crime to be. How do we understand in this country what the crime is? We look at the media. And I would say if there's a single area of activism that I would like to get behind is the transformation of the myth of trafficking as the exploitation of the poor, white, defenseless girl into a real picture that tells real stories about real people. And until we do that, we're not going to get the political will behind the issue that's going to be necessary to advocate for resources, to stand behind the legislation that we have, and to ensure that, in fact, there is equity of implementation. We have decent laws, and we need to make the laws stronger, as Shamere is saying, but the framework is in place, especially now since our trafficking legislation, and you've probably inferred this through the talk, considers the trafficking of minors, the prostitution of minors in the United States is trafficking. Right? And it's good because you can prosecute pimps as traffickers. But until the perception is changed so that crimes will be investigated that are real crimes and that DAs will take forward cases that are real cases, we're going to be facing an uphill battle.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, everyone.
I think it's on, yeah.
Okay.
You're just tall.
My name is Petra Dizdar, and I've recently joined Cindy in this fight to pass demand law here in DC. And thank you all so much for being here. And Shamere, thank you for your enthusiasm in sharing your story and helping everyone. So you said passing the demand law is really important as a way to combat this terrible crime. So what are your thoughts on why does DC not have a strong demand law? And as we get ready to push for this, what are your thoughts and advice on how best to do this? Because I feel like some kind of coalition is going to have to exist in order to really make a change here. So just any thoughts are much appreciated.
Thanks, Petra.
I must say that I am not an attorney. I'm just a girl with a message. So I don't know why DC doesn't have a demand law, but I believe every state should have a demand law because, like I said before, we can't just, it's a puzzle. Right? And a part of this puzzle is the trafficker, the victim, and the buyer. And far too many times we see the attention is focused on the pimp. We need to have strong penalties for this pimp, this pimp, this pimp, and then this girl, this girl, this girl. What about this guy here? The buyer. So I personally believe if we have strong enough laws that address the buyers, and that's what the demand law, for those who don't know what we're talking about, demand, for these buyers, it would deter men to purchase sex. Because if I know I just purchased this child and I get 30 days, and I have the financial stability to say, okay, I can pay this top-notch attorney here to get off this case, right? I have the means to support my habit, right? But if we have these strong laws that I don't care if you are this person or that person or how much money you have, it's going to be you're going to spend some time in jail here. Not 5 years, but you purchase a child. Just yesterday, right? On the news, there was a case in DC of 2 law enforcement officers that were caught with a runaway girl, right? The house in which the police officer's house that they found this girl, he wasn't charged. He's not charged, right? But you found her in his house. But the other guy who took pictures of this runaway girl, he's charged and is suspended without pay. You see what I'm saying? So we need to have some stronger penalties, because I asked Cindy, I'm just like, why in the world is this other police officer not charged? Is it because he's a police officer? Could he be that he's a sergeant and he's this reputable sergeant in our community, right? We need to cut those things away and really have these strong penalties. I don't care if you're a congressperson, because when I used to be on the track, diplomatic license plates, hello. Don't take my word for it. Go in D.C. Go in D.C. on the tracks in D.C. You will see these license plates for yourselves, right? So we need to have this demand law, the strong law that says you're not getting 30 days, you're not getting probation, you are going to give some time, because just like how this victim for the rest of her life have to suffer consequences of the shame and the guilt and going to school and especially if they're criminalized, right? You need to also face these consequences. So, I mean, I don't know if that really answers your question, but I'm just saying. It's important. Okay.
And I think, Lara, also in terms of demand laws, that's one huge piece, but safe harbor laws as well, which, you know, the federal legislation does not match state legislation, which we've talked about, and these cases are often tried on the state level. Safe harbor laws, which started in New York, protect minors from being criminalized for engaging in commercial sex, and it is hugely important that all of these laws get passed throughout the United States to protect minors from these charges that can just have a lifelong effect for them.
Absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Can't operate the technology. Thank you.
They need to be iPads. We don't know how to do
This is not really about the laws per se, but it's more about demand, and I think it really comes back to an expectation about what behaviors are okay, and there's certain things that certain people need, and if they want it, they should be able to get it. If we think in terms of prevention, some of those ideas about, you know, you may have seen or heard about research that says some men just need to have this, shouldn't we let them get it, and if we don't, there'll be negative consequences. There's still that perception, I think, that underlies why we feel like demand is sometimes considered a natural thing. This is a biological drive. It's okay. And if we try to restrict it, there's going to be bad consequences. And there's an underlying expectation that if you hear people talk about what's okay and how young can the girls be and et cetera, there's sometimes this underlying feeling of like, well, of course it's just a natural. Everybody wants that. There's sort of this that sort of normalizes the behavior that sort of is a perception or an idea that sort of validates it, right? And so I think that the people that are making decisions about what's okay and what should be a law or not, some of that stuff that we were socialized to think about from a very young age, however that came through the media or peers or hearing or watching or modeling or something, that really makes it difficult for some of these laws to move forward. And I just think that's something that we want to think about in terms of prevention and then demand, because it's an economic issue. If there was no demand, people would be out of business. Yeah. There's not going to be anything left.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. So 1 or 2 or 3? Let's see. I think we can take 3. Yeah, that should be fine.
Hi, my name's Donna Hakimian, and I'm with the Baha'is of the United States. So I just had a question about the mental health aspect of all of this. So my own expertise and background is with women political prisoners of conscience in Iran. And I know, the many women I've interviewed, the whole thing of like, I can't really share my story, there's so much shame, and it's often 5, 10, 20 years later that they've never really told someone, and they're suffering with like incredible trauma. So Sharon or Shamere, anyone else who really can maybe speak to the mental health and the way the trauma breaks down and what some sort of healthy ways to reintegrate into society are. Thanks. I understand people that are 18 or younger. So I only understand people older than that as parents of those people that are 18 or younger.
I mean, the mental health consequences, I think, are going to vary a lot across individuals. We can understand that obviously this is in the report, we consider this a form of abuse. We consider it a form of violence. We know about violence generally in terms of victims and young victims. It has huge consequences in terms of development, right? Depending on how early it happened, and depending on what kind of support systems are in place once somebody is moved out of the life, right? For a lot of victims, there's not sufficient support, so when they get out, they might be going to detention, or they might be sort of manipulated in ways that they're forced or pressured to tell a story, which is re-victimizing, right? And so, depending on some of those other circumstances, really, I think dictates how the mental health consequences might manifest. For some people, you'll see things immediately, and for others, you might not see it until many years later, right? So there's some pressure, I think, or some feeling that once you get back and you're trying to reintegrate, let's say you have a great support, you got to move really fast to put all pieces together, and you might have the systems around you. Once they sort of pull apart because they're not necessarily long-term, and that's what you need, then you might see things kind of deteriorate. But you'll see any number of things can happen, and people are so different, it's hard to know without considering what were the circumstances of the abuse or the victimization, for how long, and who's there to help them when they come out or not. That it's really kind of hard to sort of paint a picture that way. And I think what's important is that there's really no cookie cutter approach that is appropriate. What we need is to have the support available to see what does this person need and what are the best supports for them. And so that those things are available, and you can kind of work individually to put the pieces together. Some people are going to really benefit from telling their story right away, and for others, that's not the best way to go. They need more time, they need to feel more comfortable and accepted and safe to do that. And so that people vary in that, I think. Right.
Can I just add, we can talk separately about this, but what we're seeing a lot globally is people will leave their exploitative process on their own somehow. And they'll find a job or they'll live, whatever, and then years later they're finding out about the issue and they realize that this is applicable to what happened to them before. But the services, government services or NGOs don't necessarily want to provide anything to them because, well, yeah, you were in that, but now you're out now, so you must be okay, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not the case at all. So we're starting to see a lot of that, and changing attitudes about working with people, well after the fact is a new difficult task. Yeah.
When I just want to share that when I first came out the life, the mental health piece, I thought I was fine. I was 23, and I was like, well, I could take care of this on my own. I got services through Polaris, and it was mandatory that you get counseling. Well, I went through 6 psychologists before I found one that really understood me. Because the 6 psychologists that I went through, they didn't understand the trauma that I endured. And they started right at the trafficking situation. So you had a pimp and you're here because you had a pimp and you were, which is not the way to start, right? You have to get that person to open up, to get to that point, because a lot of survivors are still in denial and are suffering from Stockholm syndrome and really blaming themselves for this abuse. So it's really getting the survivor to understand that mental health doesn't mean you're crazy. Mental health doesn't mean you're stupid. Mental health is just for you to process and understand what really happened to you. In my community, mental health is not something we accept and we talk about.
I also think that there is a lack of trauma-informed care providers across the board, and that can be really difficult. So just kind of building that base would be really helpful, because a lot of times when you're looking for services in certain areas, the trauma-informed specialist just isn't there, and that can be hard when trying to find services for people.
Right. I will say just really briefly, too, the children that I work with coming from the immigration standpoint, when they're in the detention centers, it's because they're here unaccompanied, so they actually have no parent or legal guardian with them. They're by themselves and dealing with these very difficult situations. So a lot of times they are experiencing a lot of trauma. And I will say that the Office of Refugee Resettlement does a fairly good job with having therapists there, working with them and everything. They also apply for what's called, we say ATIP, but it's anti-trafficking in persons application, where they can get benefits. And that they can get the benefits while they are applying for a visa or something like that. And they also continue, the children have the right to reunify or go and live with a family member or a family friend, or in a lot of cases, especially with trafficking victims, sometimes they have nobody and they'll go into the foster care system and they'll actually fight their cases once they're out. So they actually can then continue working with mental health or other service providers once they're out and living in foster care as well. So that is very useful, especially for the younger people, the young girls, so they're not just in the detention center, but then even outside the detention center and getting continued help.
Great. Thank you. And with that, we have hit our 2 o'clock mark. So I would like to thank everybody again, Michele, Sharon, Shamere, Mari, and Lara. Thank you very much. And I guess if you could stick around, if you have more questions, the panelists will be here. Thank you.